Hello everyone, and welcome back. I'm the Lunar Librarian, and today I'll be exploring the case of Dr. Leo Stanley. Stanley was the chief surgeon of San Quentin State Prison from 1913 to 1951, during which time he would use the facility as his own personal laboratory. Today, Stanley's career has been almost completely forgotten, but his tenure as a prison chief of surgery would see him exploit prisoners of San Quentin to test his own personal medical theories, with little to no regard for the consequences of these experiments on the people who endured them. Before we begin, I'd like to give a disclaimer. This video will discuss human experimentation and genital mutilation. Stanley's experiments are fairly unsettling, so if you don't want to hear about that, then I would honestly just skip this video entirely. With that being said, this is the case of Dr. Leo Stanley. Leo Leonidas Stanley was born in 1886 in Buena Vista, Oregon. Very little documentation of Stanley's early life in Oregon is currently available. I was unable to identify the names of either of his parents, but from Stanley's own testimony of his life, it can be confirmed that his father was a doctor, that he was an only child, and that when he was 9 years old, he and his family moved from Oregon to San Luis Obispo in California, where Stanley was enrolled in Paso Robles High School. After graduating in 1903, Stanley went to Stanford University to study medicine, hoping to become a doctor like his father. However, financial difficulties meant that Stanley was forced to drop out of university a year later, instead finding work as a peanut butcher, a slang term for a newspaper salesman. Stanley would later credit his time selling newspapers as one of the most important experiences of his life, as he claimed it taught him social and interpersonal skills, stating that through sales he had, quote, learned to know people. Stanley eventually saved enough money to return to Stanford. He finished undergraduate school in 1908 and enrolled in Cooper Medical College, which had been dedicated to Stanford University that same year. After 4 years at Cooper Medical, which had been renamed to Stanford University School of Medicine, Stanley graduated in 1912. A month before he graduated, Leo married his first wife, Romaine Stanley, who he had met while she was a secretary at the college. In 1913, despite the fact that he was only a year out of medical school and had virtually no surgical experience, Stanley was offered a job as the chief surgeon of San Quentin State Prison. Although Stanley had intended to go into family medicine, similar to what his father had practiced, he and Romaine decided that the opportunity at San Quentin was too good to ignore, and so Stanley took the job and moved to San Francisco. Upon his arrival, Leo Stanley found a prison hospital in appalling condition. In his own words, quote, the ventilation was abominable, the beds were crowded together, and airspace was extremely limited. Stanley was horrified by the conditions of the prison medical facilities, and one of the first things he did as chief surgeon was to renovate the hospital, overseeing the construction of a new facility with better ventilation and sanitation policies, as well as more privacy for patients. Indeed, maintaining sterile and modern medical facilities remained a priority for Stanley throughout the duration of his career. This became especially true after his wife, Romaine, contracted tuberculosis sometime after they moved to San Francisco, an illness which left her bedridden until her death in 1926. Stanley would have been therefore acutely aware of the dangers of airborne infection and the need to maintain a sterile medical facility. In 1934, Stanley again got to upgrade his facilities when San Quentin became a men's-only prison. Prior to this, the facility had housed both men and women in separate sections of the prison, but in 1934, the San Quentin Women's Facility was replaced with a new, separate institution at Tehachapi. With the women's prison now empty, Stanley convinced the administration to give him and his staff the building, allowing Stanley to build a new, considerably larger hospital facility. Unfortunately, upgrading the prison hospital was not the only thing Stanley did. It was not just the sanitary conditions at San Quentin which appalled him. He also strongly objected to the lack of racial segregation in the prison hospital. Prior to Stanley's arrival, the San Quentin Prison Hospital had been a racially integrated facility, something which he strongly objected to. Alongside renovating the sanitation of the hospital facilities, Stanley also reintroduced segregation to the San Quentin Hospital, insisting that white inmates be treated separately from all other racial groups. In addition to reintroducing segregation, Stanley was a huge supporter of the eugenics movement, and in particular the policy of sterilization. In 1909, California passed a law allowing for the involuntary sterilization of inmates considered unfit for society. In his own words, Stanley believed that approximately 20% of prisoners fell into this category. California law, however, was more strict in its criteria for sterilization than Leo Stanley, who frequently complained to his co-workers that he was not permitted to sterilize more inmates. Wherever the law did not allow him to force sterilization, he would do his best to coerce inmates into volunteering for the procedure. Stanley printed posters extolling the benefits of a vasectomy to the prison's inmates. Some of these benefits were outright lies. Many of the men who volunteered to undergo sterilization were convinced by Stanley that the procedure would offer increased sexual performance, sexual pleasure, and potential immunity to sexually transmitted diseases. Altogether, through forced sterilization and coercion, Stanley gave approximately 600 inmates vasectomies, the majority of them being black and Hispanic, throughout the duration of his career. Sterilization was not the only method Stanley employed to use medicine as a means of punishment. Stanley did not understand his role as that of a traditional doctor. Instead, he believed the role of a prison surgeon was as much disciplinarian as it was healer. Stanley was particularly concerned with the idea that prisoners were faking their illness. Inmates at San Quentin were often made to work grueling physical jobs. Visiting the hospital was among the few occasions prisoners were given a rest from their labor, something which made Stanley especially vigilant against the possibility that any of his patients were using him to get a day off. In Stanley's view, quote, "The average prisoner is a liar. He tries to attract attention and gain pity." This attitude led to a considerable degree of medical neglect within the San Quentin Hospital, as Stanley withheld treatment for any illness he did not consider legitimate. The illnesses Stanley could not ignore were often treated without any compassion. Stanley believed it was necessary to treat prisoners without sympathy. He instructed staff to treat wounds without painkillers wherever possible, and to berate men who had been injured on the job while in the process of treating them. Stanley's contempt for prisoners ensured they received only minimal medical treatment. When Dwight Myers, an inmate at San Quentin, suffered a crushed hand in a milling accident while working, Stanley apparently chose to operate on Myers on a receptionist's table in the hospital office, instead of a proper operating room. This procedure apparently took place without any anesthetic either. As a result of the operation, Myers developed an infection which kept him in the hospital for the next 3 months. Medical care could be, and frequently was, withheld as punishment for unruliness. While this issue is larger than Stanley, representing a systemic issue within the prison, Stanley was nonetheless complicit in this practice. Steve Krim, a black inmate serving time for burglary, once described how he was denied medical care for months. Krim suffered an injury to his testicles while enduring punishment for disrespecting a guard. Rather than being taken for treatment, Krim was instead placed in solitary confinement for several months. While in solitary, Krim's injury became infected and continued to worsen until his scrotum ruptured from swelling, for which he was given towels to clean the blood and again left in solitary for an additional 3 weeks. When he was finally taken to the hospital for treatment, Stanley coldly told Krim, quote, "It's too late now. Get out." Krim never received treatment for his injury or subsequent infection. Evidently, Krim survived at least long enough to tell his story, but it is entirely unclear what long-term consequences he suffered from this infection. Krim's testimony highlights the reality that medical care at San Quentin Prison was a tool of control, something which Leo Stanley was more than willing to facilitate. Stanley did not understand a prison doctor's role to be entirely medical. He saw himself as a doctor and a disciplinarian, something which had incredible consequences for the prisoners he was supposed to care for. However, medical neglect was not the only way that Stanley abused his position of power over the prisoners in his care. Stanley saw the prison population as an ideal venue to conduct human experiments into his own theories on the origins of crime. Leo Stanley had numerous theories regarding the origins of criminal pathology. A devout adherent of the eugenics movement, Stanley subscribed to the notion that criminal behavior was a hereditary trait. This belief underscored Stanley's heavy-handed sterilization policy. Like many eugenicists, Stanley associated criminality with Black and Hispanic inmates most closely, although he also targeted the prison's gay population. However, beyond sterilization, Stanley saw the population of San Quentin as subjects he could use to test the practical applications of his eugenicist theories. I'm going to stop here to give one last warning. We'll be discussing some rather disturbing human medical experiments conducted primarily on inmates' genitals. Last chance to stop here if that makes you uncomfortable. Leo Stanley, during his time at San Quentin, developed a theory that glandular problems were the source of criminal pathology. Much of this theory concerned Stanley's research into the testicles and their effect on hormonal balance, something which was in Stanley's time an emergent field of research. Testosterone was not officially identified and named until 1935, but research conducted at the University of Chicago in 1927, and even earlier at Harvard in 1889, correlated testicular hormones with male virility in animals. Both studies implanted a concentrate derived from animal testicles into living animals, observing an increase in sexual vitality alongside more prominent male secondary sex characteristics in subjects given testosterone. Stanley was interested in testing the implications of these findings on human subjects. His first experiments began in 1918, based on the 1889 research conducted at Harvard I just mentioned. He was convinced that aging prisoners, many suffering from what was likely untreated dementia, could be revitalized through testicular grafting or transplants. Stanley believed that understanding the importance of testosterone was important to control criminal activity, but also to improve male health and vitality outside of prison. These concerns existed alongside the eugenics movement's preoccupation with increasing the white Protestant birth rate, concerned that the white population was being, quote-unquote, overrun by Black, Hispanic, and East Asian people. In addition to proving that white genocide has always been something that gullible people are willing to believe, this concern helps to explain why Stanley came to be so focused on testicular experimentation. Driven by his eugenicist beliefs and the emergent field of androgenic research, Stanley came to see San Quentin as a venue to conduct experiments which he believed were to the benefit of white American society. Stanley's method of research involved harvesting testicles from recently executed inmates and then implanting them into aging prisoners. testicles were harvested with or without the consent of executed inmates or their families. This can be confirmed by the case of Clarence Buck Kelly. Kelly, who was executed on 3 counts of homicide on May 11, 1928, was an ideal candidate for Stanley's experiments. After his execution, Kelly's testicles were removed from his body for implantation into another inmate, a procedure which had been occurring for nearly a decade by the time of Kelly's death. However, when Kelly's family discovered what had happened, they filed a lawsuit against Stanley personally for his mutilation of Kelly's corpse, proving that his family had not given consent for the procedure. Stanley displayed only little more concern for the consent of his living subjects. Although Stanley was sure to experiment only on inmates who had given verbal permission, it should be noted that many of these inmates had little power to refuse. As mentioned earlier, medical neglect was a form of discipline in San Quentin, meaning prisoners surely feared the consequences of saying no. Beyond the fear of medical reprisal, many of Stanley's subjects were elderly inmates suffering from various stages of dementia, infirmity, or other conditions. The medical ability of many of these inmates to give consent or make decisions on their own is questionable at best. However, it is unlikely that Stanley truly cared about the legitimacy of his subjects' consent. Either through infirmity, fear, or genuine willingness, Stanley only cared that he got enough subjects to test his theories. His objective with implantation was predominantly focused on finding a way to restore vitality to elderly men. However, Stanley also claimed that his method of testicular implantation offered a means to control criminal behavior, once claiming that after testicular implantation, a 25-year-old man, whose name is unknown, had been, quote, cured permanently of his criminal tendencies. Wherever testicles of inmates could not be acquired, the testicles of pigs, goats, deer, or other livestock were substituted, something which became much more common after the Kelly lawsuit. Stanley also began experimenting with a crude form of testosterone injections. He would macerate harvested testicles into a paste and then inject the paste into inmates. I was unable to find any information as to what effects, if any, this procedure had on the people subjected to it, but that did not stop Stanley from claiming this procedure could cure all sorts of ailments, from asthma to depression, claims for which there is absolutely no evidence. Between testicular implantation and his crude form of testosterone injection, it is believed that Stanley conducted over 10,000 procedures on inmates by 1940. However, this number is likely unreflective of the true scale of human experimentation that occurred under Stanley's tenure. This is because Stanley also encouraged his subordinates to conduct their own experiments on prisoners, considering them the ideal population for testing. On December 7th, 1941, the Empire of Japan launched an attack on Pearl Harbor, a U.S. naval base in Honolulu, Hawaii, drawing the United States into the Second World War. This would have massive consequences for San Quentin Prison. Whereas before, inmates may have volunteered for human experimentation out of fear or a lack of alternative options, the war made some inmates see experimentation as a matter of patriotism. All across the U.S., in San Quentin as well as other prisons, inmates volunteered themselves for experimentation in an act of patriotic zeal. If they could not fight the war on the front lines, they would settle for fighting it in the laboratories. This is not to say coercion did not still drive many to volunteer in wartime, but the war nonetheless encouraged some prisoners to volunteer for experimentation as a means of serving their country. Ironically, just as the war made human experimentation in American prisons more acceptable than ever before, Stanley took a leave of absence in order to serve in the U.S. military. Leo Stanley joined the U.S. Navy just days after the Pearl Harbor attack, allowing Navy physicians to run their own experiments with the San Quentin medical facilities while he served. Stanley would spend the war stationed at various bases in California, excluding a brief posting at Pearl Harbor, serving as a physician for wounded sailors. After the war ended, Leo Stanley resumed his position at San Quentin. However, he found the prison had changed considerably in his absence. The conclusion of World War II meant that information regarding the Holocaust had become available to the general American public. In light of Nazi human experimentation, the California Department of Corrections was unwilling to tolerate Stanley's own experimental procedures, or his hard-boiled and cold approach to patient care. Instead, Stanley found that the prison system was reorganizing around therapeutic solutions to crime, and that his industrial-scale glandular experimentation would be a thing of the past. After 6 more years at San Quentin, Leo Stanley retired from the prison and founded his own private clinic, before abandoning that practice and spending time as an onboard doctor for a cruise liner company. Eventually, Stanley retired from medicine altogether to a farm in Marin County, California, where he died in 1976 at the age of 90. Today, Leo Stanley has been largely forgotten. His glandular theories of crime have been debunked, and his legacy is largely limited to a brief Wikipedia page, a small handful of YouTube videos, and a few mentions in larger histories of the prison he worked in. However, Stanley also represents a particularly dark era of American medicine. His tenure as chief surgeon of San Quentin saw thousands of prisoners subjected to completely experimental procedures in order to benefit the personal theories and racist ideologies of the man who was supposed to be caring for their well-being. I'm the Lunar Librarian. I don't really know how to end this video. It just kind of sucks. So I'll just end it here. Thanks for watching if you've made it this far, and until next time, goodbye.